Well, welcome everybody to our very first episode of or segment of Poverty Mythbusters. I'm going to turn it over. My name is Angie Peters. I'm the president and CEO of Yonge Street Mission. And I'm going to turn it over to Angela Solomos, our VP of Philanthropy, to acknowledge this meeting.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which YSM serves the people of Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Before I turn the floor over to Angie Peters and our panelists, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping. As with any online platform that is live, we are hoping that we do not run into any technical difficulties. But if you do, you can reach out to Barb Kozakowicz, whose number and email you had in the invitation to today's event, and she's available and ready to help you. We do have the opportunity for you to ask questions throughout the event today. We may not get to answering them all today, but we do promise that we will answer them all. But there will be a short Q&A, and we hope to get to as many of them as possible. And finally, I wanted to let you know that we are recording today's session. We are doing so that we can share it back with you and that we can share it with others. So please make note, and we look forward to a wonderful conversation today. Back to you, Angie.
Well, hi, everybody. Welcome again to this first segment of Poverty Mythbusters. We're so excited for the conversation that we're going to have today and going forward in the subsequent segments. Mythbusters, why did we pick that name? Well, what's a myth? A myth is something that we believe that influences, our actions and our behaviors, and it may or may not be, it's likely not true, or at least not wholly true if it's a myth. And certainly poverty, as we know, is complex, and it's also a societal condition. So there's many factors that influence it, and so it's hard to understand. It's especially hard to understand if you've got no experience of poverty personally, or really no exposure to what it's like to live in our city today with not enough. And so what we want to do today is, in this first episode, really give you more insight into what it's like to live with poverty. If you're here, it's clear that you care. It's clear that you want to make a difference. And so really, we just want to equip you with more information about what it is like, so that together we can look forward to what we might do to make the kind of difference that we really want to make. So let's get going, shall we? We wanted to set the stage a little bit for this first segment. So really, at the end of today, or our little time together today, what we're hoping is that we'll have more understanding. And then in subsequent sessions, we'll get into more of the details of what kind of difference we can make. But to begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of a backdrop of what poverty looks like, first at the macro level for our city and for our province. How is our city doing? How is our province doing with respect to poverty? Because I think we all know that we'd love to have a city and be a part of a province where people are able to thrive and belong and fully participate in society. Well, how are we doing? These stats give us a backdrop of how we're doing. So Toronto, as you may know, and you may have seen in the news a lot, especially during the pandemic, has ever widening income disparity. And there's some challenges that come with that. But part of the reason for that is Toronto is the most expensive major city in the country in which to live. And critical costs such as rent and transit and childcare and tuition are rising at a faster rate than overall inflation. So it's expensive to live here. And so what we see is that the city of Toronto in particular has a very high child poverty rate. In fact, the highest child poverty rate in the country. So that's very significant. And other things that we see that are factors are that, provincially, how are we doing? Ontario is actually one of only 2 provinces where the percentage of the people that live in Ontario that are living in poverty went up over a period of 13 years. And that's the latest census data. So we actually know since the pandemic, it's gone even higher. But in that period of time, 2003 to 2016, it went up by 26%. Now, this is in contrast to other parts of our country where, for example, in BC, the same number went down by 21%. So clearly it's possible to have the kind of society that we want. But at the moment, we're not trending in that direction. Sadly, poverty is going up. And one of the things that is contributing to that is that our spending per capita on social services is the least amount per capita in Canada, a full 2,000 per person less than the Canadian average. And it's growing at less than the average rate. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that our system, at least what we're doing today, isn't leading to the outcomes we want or we desire. It's outdated. It's not addressing the poverty issues of today. And our spending is going down, which means poverty is going up. In addition to that, the system, the rules within the system to participate in the system have changed a lot over the years. Qualifications for supports have tightened, as well as things have been introduced like clawbacks. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but what you'll see is that the system's kind of designed in such a way that it prevents people from building resources, building rainy day funds, building the sorts of things that help them move forward in their life. And actually, in many ways, goes from being what it's supposed to be, which is a platform to help people move forward, and has turned into kind of a trap. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Now, all of that said, we have hope. And yes, the system does need to change, but even before that, we know that we have us, we have community, we have people like yourselves who care, and that differences can be made. We have the resources in this city, and the very first step, which is what today is all about, begins with understanding truly what poverty looks like today. What is the problem we are trying to solve before we figure out how we're going to intervene? So let's dive into the panel, shall we? So I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to put on their cameras. And I'd like to introduce Kristen Boy, our Manager of Housing Services, Sylvia Curia, who's Care Management and Intake Specialist, and Joel Clausen, our Community Capacity Builder in our Community Development Department. So they're going to be joining me today. And you can open your cameras, folks. And I'd like to turn over and ask the first question to Kristen. So Kristen, in your role as housing manager, you come across people when they're in deep crisis, in great need on a regular basis. Can you share an example that will help paint a picture for people today who are wanting to learn what it's really like for a family who is in housing need and experiencing crisis?
Sure. Thank you, Angie. It's great to be here. I'm going to invite you all to listen to a story. I'm going to tell a story about a family of 4, mom and dad and 2 kids. 8 years old and 10 years old are the kids. Mom has lost her job during COVID, and so has been staying at home, supporting the kids, especially during the waves of virtual school, going in, hopping on and off with having to stay home to do education. Dad works as a security guard. And in this job, he's lucky if he gets 40 hours at work. He also doesn't feel very connected to his place of work or very supported by his boss. So dad is the only income earner in this family. And with the money that he makes, half of that goes to rent, which is $1,400 for a 1-bedroom in a high-rise building. Dad also has to travel a long ways to get to work, multiple methods of transportation with TTC, and oftentimes waiting for buses to come. So the nature of a security job means long hours on your feet, walking around, standing, which is hard. And dad's been experiencing pain in his legs and in his feet, and he's been requesting a position where he can sit down, but he hasn't heard anything. So just in general, dad is feeling frustrated. He's feeling stuck, but he also knows that his income is vital to paying bills, to paying rent, to supporting his family. And it's extremely disheartening for him with how hard he has to work just to barely make ends meet. The family's also feeling the pinch of what it costs to live, especially within food and the rising food costs, and wanting to provide adequately for the family. So one week, dad's pain in his feet gets super bad and he can't make it to work. He misses some shifts and he is promptly fired. So this is a big stressful event. All of a sudden, dad is home all the time during the day. Kids are trying to do virtual school. Mom is there too. Remind you that this is 4 people living in a 1-bedroom. So mom and dad sleep in the bedroom and kids are in the living room. It's not a lot of space for everybody.
Kristen, can I ask a question on that? I mean, so why are they in a 1-bedroom? Like, can you just spell that out for us? That seems really hard, especially with homeschooling during the pandemic and now, job loss. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very hard in Toronto's housing market to increase your housing space based on your family size. Oftentimes, families are growing in place because the trying to move to more space is just not tenable with where rent costs are. And why can't he get a new job? For one, he can't get a reference from the security job he was working. He has no relationship there with that company. He's still dealing with the pain and the injuries to his legs and feet that he was experiencing. He's also exhausted. He's extremely unmotivated. Mom was able to find a job in this story. She was able to get work, but it's only about 15 hours a week, and it's in the evenings and weekends as a cleaner. So very quickly, this family is facing a big drop to their income. And very quickly, they're having to choose between, do we get groceries or do we pay rent? And they decide.
Sorry, just to jump in. So why don't they have savings? Like, because that's what we would have, rainy day, we'd have some savings for a job loss to get us through. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ability to have savings is really linked to your job security, to having a job that matches the cost of living, so that as you look at what it pays, remember 50% of their income goes to rent. And so after that, you still might be looking at some utility fees, at some groceries, at TTC. If they are having to pay when the kids are in school, if they're having to pay for aftercare for those kids, that it's all adding up very quickly, leaving very little room to have that safety net to see them through a couple months of job loss. And with paying rent, very quickly as you fall into arrears, they receive a letter from the landlord saying that if I don't see some sort of payment in 2 weeks, then I have the ability to start pursuing an eviction. So this is just a really hard time. It's a very stressful time. And one night, the siblings, the kids, get into a fight, and they're running around. One is chasing the other, and a lamp is knocked over. It falls to the floor, makes a big crash. Dad is on the couch and he yells. He yells at the kids, "What's going on? You just broke that lamp. Stop fighting." What happens though, when you are living in apartment buildings close to other people, is that it's very common to hear noises from each other's units. And in this instance, when a neighbor heard the crash of the lamp and the sound of the yelling, they decided to call the police because they thought that there was a domestic incident happening in the home.
That's so hard, right? I mean, I once had a young family with little kids. They're now grown. I think you have a young family right now with little ones. I think I've yelled at my kids. you know, how is this family in particular that you're telling us a story about, how are they similar to us and how are they different in terms of their desires, but different in terms of their challenges and the resources that they have to deal with it?
Yeah, I think it can be very relatable to perhaps other parents listening, to think about what you hope for the future of your kids, what you might worry about at night when you want to provide for your family, when you want to treat your kids, when you want to have a great Christmas with lots of nice presents, maybe a family vacation. These are all things that I think are very common and what we would hope for our families and for our children. And I think the big difference there is to sort of think about, well, if I was in the situation where I didn't have a job that didn't have security for paid sick days, for instance, or I didn't have a job that paid very much, so I didn't have a safety net, or I didn't have somebody I could call to say, I need a resume, can you help me do this? This family was really lacking in its community supports to reach out and say, hey, we need help with watching the kids to get out for the day so we can do a good job search. These are all things, when you think about what would I do in this situation, I think those are key differences that sort of escalated this family much quicker to a point of crisis.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, I just imagine the difference it would make if this dad had paid sick days. That's a really good point. Well, thank you for that, Kristen. I'm going to transition now. We're going to move over to Sylvia. So Sylvia, in your role, you were called in when a family is in crisis, especially in the context of the partnership that we have with Children's Aid Society Toronto. So you were the initial contact for this family. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened when you met them?
Yeah, and maybe we can start off from where Kristen left off, just to continue journeying with this family, to get a better understanding of how they interact with the different systems that led us to us being involved. So we have the police who have been called to the home. They arrive. Again, they see a family, they see children, and they decide to treat this as a domestic disturbance. And so at this point, they decide to call the Children's Aid Society. Children's Aid Society worker arrives at some point in time and finds out that this family does have an eviction date. They will be homeless very soon. And so, this family might not be aware of tenant and landlord board. This is a board that can support families in maintaining their home by providing resources, fighting the arrears that they're in. It could also be that this family does not have the energy or the time to go through that system. It is a system that you need to apply, you need to appear. And so there's a lot that needs to happen for you to be successful. And let's be honest, they're limited in their resources. They won't pay your rent. The resources are very limited. And so at some point, this family is homeless. They do find themselves homeless. And the Children's Aid Society worker decides to assist them with finding a shelter. Central intake is a centralized access system for individuals and families in Toronto that require emergency shelter placement. And it's all based on availability. It's a first come, first serve basis. There's a short expiration time between when you make the call and they tell you what place is available for you to report. And if you do not report to that shelter that has been assigned to you, you are at risk of losing your spot. And so that means you'll have to start over and call them and find another shelter. It can be anywhere in the city. There's little choice in terms of where you want to be placed. And there's very limited shelters to begin with, but even less shelters that are catered to families. And so when this family calls, they find out that there are no available spots in family shelters. And so it's recommended that they go to different shelters that is given a spot in a men's shelter on one end of the city, and mom is given a shelter in another end of the city with the children. And so this shelter is really far from mom's work. So the commute has increased, the amount of money that she's spending on transportation has increased. She's doing evening and weekend jobs. It's becoming tough to do those shifts because shelters have rules and regulations. They might have a curfew, and the curfew might be working against mom's work shifts. They can also, she does not have anyone to leave the children with. And so she's stuck with that. Dad, on the other hand, you see, when he lost his job, he applied for employment insurance, also known as EI, but he wasn't qualified because of the way he lost his job. And so he was not able to get EI. He tried for Ontario Works. Ontario Works, some of you might know it, is social assistance. They offer financial and employment assistance for individuals who are struggling with meeting immediate living expenses. So it could be from food or housing. And so dad is able to qualify, but only under a single individual because he does not have the children under his care. And for a single person, you're looking at $733 a month for basic needs and shelter. And because dad does not have rent that he's paying, he's not getting the full $733. Dad is also still struggling to find work, right? And so this family finds themselves finding it difficult to get back to their feet. Finding another place to rent is hard. They discovered that, the place that they had was the amount that they were paying for rent was actually on the cheaper end, because right now a $1,400 will get you maybe a bachelor's unit. And then if they do not have credit check, they do not have employment letters, they do not have references from previous landlords. And so there's so many different barriers in their way of getting back on their feet. And they cannot apply for subsidized housing or community housing because the waiting list is 10 years plus, right? And so the CS worker, the Children's Aid Society worker, looks at this family, assess the family's needs, and realizes this is a family that is struggling because of poverty and not necessarily because there's child safety concerns. And because of that unique partnership we have, they're like, you know what? We trust YSM to come in and support this family with their needs while maintaining the well-being of the children in the home. And so this is where Angie, I get to be introduced to the family and we connect with them.
Yeah. Wow, Sylvia, there's so much in that story to take in, I think. And I think the most disconcerting part is that when they were in crisis, and the job loss occurred, and this sort of triggered the arrears and the rent and everything, that just sort of seems like it's just a big spiral downward. The system responded by splitting them up. Yeah. And then actually, as a result of that, they got less social income support. So it feels really dire. It feels really hopeless. So we need some of your hope. So what is it that YSM, what is it that you do for this family that starts to help them on the journey out, regardless of all these barriers?
Right. I think the one thing that is really key in the work that we do, and even just the pursuit of social justice, is hope. Hope is so important. There is a saying that goes, hope is the only bee that makes honey without flowers, because hope can do so much. It can improve quality of life. It can reduce stress. Just imagine the amount of stress that this family is in. Not just the parents, but the children. They've been uprooted from their home, all that they've known, to this place where they're sharing rooms and common areas with people, with strangers, right? People who are going through their own issues. And so there's just chaos and so much instability that is happening with this family. And so we want to inspire hope when we meet with them. We want to present the possibility of things getting better in terms of meeting the material condition, but also showing them the strengths that they still have Sometimes when you're in the thick of things, you do not realize how strong you are. You do not realize what resources you have within yourself or within that family unit. And so we want to make sure that we're investing in that family, that even if they're separated, we're still putting them together so that they can work together and maintain that family unit, and use the available strength that are in there. But you know what, Angie, I think at the end of the day, it's also important to know that we work within the system. So just as the Ontario Works and the other systems that I mentioned have limitations and criteria that sometimes makes other people be left behind, we also might end up doing that, right? We also clock out at the end of the day. And so it's so important that we create a community around this family that will continue championing them on when we clock out, when we're not there anymore. For future times when something else happens, another crisis happens, that they'll have other people there. And so our work with families, our work with individuals is not about just addressing the material conditions they find themselves in, but it's also building community for them so that they can utilize that for future events.
That's amazing. Thanks so much, Sylvia. Yeah, I think what you said about hope is so important, because when you think back to the story and what you said about Dad and his sense of, kind of despair, because he had been working hard and because he had a physical ailment, he lost his job, and now the division of the family, like you can see where it would be hard to hope, and it's important to start there and rebuild.
Yes.
And then people are able to engage in the support services that you provide, like around housing supports and income supports and all those other things that we do, even family counseling, all of those things. So it's important. And like you said, it's still not enough.
It's still not enough.
It's still not enough. And there's a role for community.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to move into our next segment with Joel. And Joel, you were uniquely positioned in Regent Park working with families in community development. Can you tell us, as you work with families that are kind of like this family started out, right? 2 incomes, working hard, still not enough, but trying to provide for their family with all the same kinds of hopes and dreams that we have. And they're hitting up against barriers, systemic and community barriers, if you will. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you see happening in community where residents themselves are stepping up and trying to help each other overcome those barriers?
Yeah, sure, Angie. I think the needs that I see, that I've recognized, that I hear about from people, they're the same needs that I have, that you have, that just about anybody has. Things like the kinds of things that we've heard about already in part, like a steady income, access to services, well-being and safety for their children, and a sense of belonging. I think when people are facing the kinds of challenges that you've just heard about from Kristen and Sylvia, it's pretty hard to keep your head above water. That's kind of what you've been pointing to. And I think that's where those supports can be so life transforming. It allows people to get back on their feet. So then the work that I do, it's in a community with people who know about these crises. Maybe they've been through them themselves. Maybe they've seen neighbors or family members that have gone through them. It's not foreign territory. And that's where there's a real strength in that. And so let me explain that a little bit. So our work in community development, so we're not doing that direct help, but it's about creating those conditions, like Sylvia was alluding to, creating those conditions to support community to come together. And when that happens, it's kind of like a powerful loom. Like there's this weaving that happens of so many different strands. And I think those of us that are in this call today, we make up some of those strands. So let me just give you a little bit of background about the community where I'm working. It's Regent Park. There's a revitalization happening that's changing the community from 100% of everybody living in there being in social housing to a mix of private and social housing. It's coming towards the end. There's 10 more years left. And our team, our community development team, has aligned our work with the social side of that, with building that cohesive and inclusive social fabric where those new buildings will give a home to a thriving community. So what are some of those? Let's just dig a bit deeper. Some of those needs that people might have. Like many of the people in the neighborhood are immigrants to Canada, and many people who immigrate to Canada are only able to find those low-paying or those precarious jobs that are so common for people on the lower end of the income scale. Even people that come with academic credentials, they still might face those same barriers. And if anything that happens, as we've heard, anything that happens to a person's ability to hold their job, they can be pretty quickly facing big problems. Another dimension is this raising of safe and healthy children who can engage in constructive activities that encourage their development. There's a lot of pressures, and people want to have as many opportunities as possible to guide their children well. Women have to balance family responsibilities. Many women are in the situation where they have to balance family responsibilities with wanting to earn some income. So there's, those are just a smattering, a taste of some of the kinds of needs that people are facing and how they address them. Well, there's a lot of work in this work that we're in. It's called this social side of the revitalization. There's a network called the Social Development Plan Stakeholders Table. And through that, there's a voice of the community that is really pushing hard for more jobs, and especially for more local jobs. There's so much money going into the neighborhood in terms of this building new buildings and some social funding as well. And people want to see that the money that's being invested in the community actually has a benefit for the local people. So there's a lot of energy going into that in many different ways. For safe and healthy children, I work with a group called Access to Recreation, where they've seen that their kids aren't getting into the lessons in the local pool. I mean, there's a lot that I could go into there, but basically we've been working through advocacy, and we've found ways to get the kids into the pools through their school time, which is a great achievement, but there's still more to do. There's still a lot more to do that the community wants to do to be able to get better access to recreation. And not only that, but creating employment paths for the youth in the community to be able to use recreation as a way to start their employment path. And in terms of women finding income opportunities, there's many different initiatives in the neighborhood, including one from Yonge Street Mission called Women's Development Network, that is bringing women together to support each other to create small-scale entrepreneurial opportunities. So there's a lot of different strands to this community development work, ways that, again, are helping people release their energy.
Just a question, Joel,
Yeah.
just to dive in. I think there's so much going on there, and it's clear that there's a lot of intentional activity that is, doing a number of things, right? That are creating sort of community supports and removing community barriers and societal barriers for people who are kind of struggling on the income scale. But, I think that this part of the work is the hardest to understand part of the work for someone who's not engaged in it, right? And so community development and creating a stronger social fabric can sound a little bit esoteric, right? Like, how does that, when you think about the raw, sort of easier to understand, meeting basic human needs and moving into this fostering a community that, I like what you said earlier, it's about thriving, right? It's almost like the programs are about surviving, and then what we do in community development is about helping people thrive. How does that connect to sustainably moving out of poverty? Why is that important to do?
Yeah, so I can say a little bit more, even just about the basics, like, for example, the steady income, the job, and some of that funding that's coming into the community. There's been advocacy from the community. So this fabric, this network that is coming together. One of the things they've been able to achieve is there's a thing called community benefits, where as a part of the contract for the developer, they must put money into the community, and that there's $26 million that's allotted for that. There may be others as well, but there's that for sure. And the community has through their organizing into a community benefits coalition, they've made a strong voice to ensure that that money will be creating meaningful, good, steady work for local people. So that's an example. And but there's more than that too. There's like when people come together and the community can see that they can make a difference by coming together, there's so many ripple effects from that. So like people can see the example. Look, my neighbor is doing this, or my family member is doing this. We can make a difference by coming together, and there's a sense of empowerment there, a sense of agency. And that just ripples through a whole community. It releases people's energy. The level of commitment that people have to doing this work it's pretty incredible. They will just show up, and they will expect their neighbors to show up. They will expect us to show up, and they just bring lots of creativity and lots of passion to making that change. There's a sense of belief from a lot of people. I mean, yeah, there's always the, wow, is this really going to happen? But the energy that's been released through some of this work that we're doing is pretty impressive. I'm just feel very privileged to be able to be part of it. You know, and then ultimately, if you have that neighborhood voice, if that really becomes strong, and if we find ways to make that ripple through all of the city, like it's the people that are living on low incomes that really are going to make, like that energy is a driving energy. That energy will make change. And I think those are the people that if we know how to and are able to come alongside them in meaningful ways, they are the motor that will drive the car that will get us to the end of poverty.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's really powerful. Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost intuitive, right? If we are people on this call who care about poverty and are disturbed by it and want to help people who are experiencing it, the logical place to start to understand what needs to be done is with the people themselves, right? They know most what needs to be done. And what the story you've told about the Community Benefits Coalition is just this lovely example of residents and resident leadership and agency support, and then even private support of a developer coming in to invest in something that's going to create not just, you know, jobs that are low income and don't have, say, for example, paid sick days off, but perhaps even trades with a very lucrative career in the future. So thank you so much for that, Joel. Just to weave things together a little bit, you know, we've talked a little bit about the programs, and the programs and the social services are really the human development and the support. And then what Joel just talked about is how the community coming together creates relationships and social fabric. And even in the case of something like the Women's Development Network, where it may not be so obvious what a group of women coming together to make small amounts of income means, but when you think about the need for relationships and community supports, well, we all need that, right? None of us function in a vacuum, and the relationships that are formed in these contexts are so valuable, because then they become peer supports. They become the person that mom can call to say, hey, can you pick up my kid from school because I have a late shift? You know, those things that are part of our regular lives start to become parts of their lives that reduce isolation and make it possible for them to begin to move towards thriving. So that family story has helped us see a lot of things. And so I want to go back to the slide I showed with the facts about the city at the beginning. And when you think about these data points, we can now understand them with that story at a human level in a few different ways. One is, I think it helps us to see that a different approach is needed if we're going to end up having the kind of city that has different stats than this, much more equity and inclusion and really opportunity for people to fully participate in our society and in our communities. It shows us and it helps us see that community actually plays a pivotal role in creating the kind of city we want to have, and that we're all investing in trying to make happen. And I think it also communicates and helps us see that really, but for the grace of God, there go all of us, right? The big difference between where we stand and the resources that we have presently in our lives and where the families that we serve stand is not in any sort of human desire or intent but more in the resources that we have to work with to weather life events. And life events happen to all of us. We just happen to have a lot more resources to help us get through them. So when we think about the families and understanding the current situation, it really comes down to this. The families, due to the system that they're a part of now, are without us really potentially one illness away from losing everything. And this is the challenge that we have in terms of now thinking about how do we move forward from this, and what are the opportunities for us to change some of what people are experiencing and make a really big difference. The next slide that we're going to share shows you some of the myths. So we started by talking about myths. What are the things that we believe that are wholly or in part not true, that are just formed on the basis of all the influences and sources of information that we have in our lives. And the first one is really that the government will take care of people who are in poverty. And I think from the story that we've shared today and from the team, that you can see that it doesn't really do that anymore. And the system really needs to be redesigned on the basis of what poverty looks like today, not what it looked like back in post-Second World War when it was designed, because our society is very different and the needs are very different and the city is very different. The other myth is that that if someone is poor, it's in some way their fault. It's because they don't have the will or the desire or the energy, or they would just rather be on social assistance. Things that sometimes are messages that are woven through the things that we see and hear. And of course, you can see that it's not about that. People are working really, really hard, and yet they're still kind of trapped by the system that we have and that we're a part of. And people really are no different than us. And we have the opportunity, because of all the great resources in this city, and the great desire, I think, Toronto is incredibly wealthy with the rich community and sense of charity and responsibility to community. And that's not all over the world. That should not be taken for granted. That's a gift. And it's also a resource. And I think that it is the reason why we have hope that we can make the difference that we're trying to make, which is to work towards the end of chronic poverty in a generation together. So we have some time for questions. So we'd like to go to a Q&A, and what I'm going to do is just see if there's any questions that have been submitted here. Have a look here. Okay, I'm looking at one here that we can talk about. And maybe the panelists, you could all put your cameras on for this part of the conversation. So this question is for Sylvia. Sylvia, the story you shared highlights the experience of an entire family. Does YSM work with the mom or the dad individually, or will you work with the entire family, kids and all?
From our work believes in healthy families being a foundation for healthy communities. And so when we meet with families, or when we talk to people who are looking for supports, we really make them understand that we are working with every single member of that family. It's really important that our work is done with the whole family unit, just because, again, investing in families has shown a great deal of good results at the end of the day, decreasing youth homelessness, just again building healthy communities. So when we meet families, we do work with them, and we will connect with the individual members of the family, but the main focus is keeping that family unit intact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm just seeing a note that we are up for time and we can't do any more questions. So I'm just gonna wrap this up. But thank you, Kristen and Sylvia and Joel, for just sharing your insights with everybody today. And so I just want to move to the last slide and wrap this up and respect everybody's time. Thank you so much, everybody, for desiring to learn more and wanting to be a part of making a difference in our city. Thank you for the conversation that we hope is launched out of this. And of course, you all know how to reach us for dialogue between now and our next webinar, which is going to be Thursday, May 5th, where we're going to dive a little bit more into this and start to look at some of the solutions and what's happening towards changing lives and changing our city. Together, we actually believe that we can ensure that our actions lead to the kinds of outcomes in our city that are aligned with our values. And today, that's the biggest challenge. The outcomes in our city are not aligned with our values, but we control our actions and we have the resources to make the difference. So thank you so much for being a part of this. I want to end with this quote: "We help people when we see them as weak. We fix people when we see them as broken, but we serve people when we see them as valuable." Thank you so much for your time today, and we hope to see you at the next webinar on May 5th. Take care. Bye-bye.